Honourable member from Red Deer, Mountain View.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And before I became a parliamentarian, first for the member of Red Deer and now as representative for the great riding of Red Deer Mountain View, I spent 35 years as a high school math and physics teacher. And as such, I always felt that when dealing with problems, I believe it's critical to be concise and to work with undeniable facts. And this is a task that we all have here at hand in this House, a task that this House seized over a grievous disservice to the Canadian public, a task that must continue to go forward until this grievous matter has been rightfully resolved. But of course, whether or not this can be resolved remains to be seen, as the Liberal government thinks it can gaslight Canadians into believing that somehow enabling corruption protects Canadians. Let me be on the record today that this government's reaction to the production order of the Speaker shows that they are only interested in protecting those that have been the benefactors of 9 years of corruption, irresponsible deficits, and dishonesty to the Canadian taxpayer. I and the people of Red Deer Mountain View have seen enough. Here's what we're up against. What you get when you have significant lapses in governance and stewardship of public funds, plus poor management over conflicts of interest, plus non-compliance with the law. Mr. Speaker, you get corruption, plain and simple. And this is the root cause of the case we, as His Majesty's official opposition and as servants to Canadians, are prosecuting today. The Auditor General found all those ingredients for corruption in a blistering report released this past summer. Now, I've spent many years sitting on the Public Accounts Committee, and since the time of Sheila Fraser, have had the greatest respect for the officials that work at the Auditor General's office. What they have uncovered is mind-boggling. Now, as a teacher, whenever my students were tasked with solving a difficult physics problem, you know what they had to do? They had to show their work. And when the first steps became clear, they could easier progress through to the next stage of the solution. Students had to show how they came up with an answer to get the problems they were attempting to solve. And this gets more challenging and the more difficult and complex the problem becomes. But in that way, basic truths allow them to analyze and solve more complicated questions. So I'll acknowledge that managing a federal government, the federal government of Canada, is not an easy task. Overseeing how we will feed Canadians and our allies around the world, how we will safeguard the value of Canadian sovereignty and citizenship, and how we will have secure, reliable, affordable energy for all Canadians is indeed a complex venture. But these federal departments that we rely on must build upon trust and truth. It's all the more an indictment on this government that they are unwilling to show their work and fulfill an order from the House to produce the documents that you, Mr. Speaker, have decreed that this government clearly did not comply to. Mr. Speaker, if we are supposed to tell our children, our youth, the bright-minded young minds of the future, that they need to show their work when solving their math homework, why on earth is our federal government not able to do the same? And so, Mr. Speaker, I have a suggestion as to why. Maybe it has to do with the reality that they are so caught up in their desperate attempts to cling to power that they will ignore House orders to procure documents on their failed, glorified slush fund, and that they will overlook what Canadians coast to coast already see when they tune in to their federal legislature. That this government has lost control of this House and must accept the reality that Canada is ready for a change. A change for the better, a change that will do away with scandal after scandal after scandal. In the Auditor General's report that I mentioned earlier, the report makes it clear that Sustainable Development Technology Canada, or SDTC, did not establish clear assessment guidance to determine eligibility of projects. So let's allow that to sink in. According to the SDTC's website, as of March 31st, 2023, they had given out $1.71 billion in funding. Assessments guidance that determines eligibility of projects is fancy talk for how decisions are made to give money to projects and businesses. It's absolutely ridiculous then that a federally funded foundation under this government's watch was able to hand out taxpayers' dollars without a clear idea of who ought to be deserving of those funds to achieve the objectives its organizations were established to fulfill. It's no different than if a football team were paying a coach to run plays and make decisions without the notion of a playbook. The idea that taxpayer dollars were allowed to be played with in this manner is unacceptable and frankly disturbing. To better illuminate the gravity of this situation, I should once again draw on my teaching experience. So let's all put ourselves in the shoes of a grade 11 high school student who's beginning to complete what teachers sometimes call an independent research project. So in an independent research project, usually students are tasked with coming up with a topic to study, but the important part of the teacher is to give students a framework with which they will be able to structure their assignment and therefore use their findings effectively. Without an assignment structure or grading criteria, students are left with little to go on. So do we want federally funded foundations to be in the habit of having little to go on? What I'm trying to highlight by drawing out these parallels that we take for granted as common sense in a classroom is that these classroom experiences often seem to be very similar to what happens in the real world. Perhaps this is by design. That's why I believe this picture that I'm trying to paint for Canadians, for those who I've had the pleasure of teaching, and for all of us here in this House. The Auditor General's report also found that the SDTC poorly managed conflicts of interest. And this, my colleagues, is really where I struggle to find any sort of solace from the Liberal government's response to this scandal. SDTC records showed that conflict of interest policies were not followed in 90 cases, and that SDTC did not report conflicts of interest. I say this is shocking, but it's on par with what we and Canadians have now come to expect from our current government. And this is a shame. There is an obvious reality that in order for Canada to be the greatest country on earth, we need a new government that respects the rights of Canadians, has integrity, and possesses a strong commitment to principles. It would seem that this no longer is the case after 9 years of this NDP Liberal government. Back in the day, to their credit, Liberals stayed true to their word and would aim to avoid such scandals, although the Gomery inquiry shook their confidence so many years ago. However, today, those actions are commonplace and feel as though they are just a matter of daily business. True Liberals are now fleeing what has now become a shadow of its former self. So I'm a firm believer that humility is a virtue, and a particularly valuable one for an elected representative of the people. Is it not common sense for us? Is it not common sense for decision makers of a fund to recuse themselves from an investment decision regarding a firm that they have clear ties to? I'm sure it must be challenging to conduct this practice when the fund in question is both funded by this Liberal government and also is in talks with firms that have strong insider connections to their network. And so I ask again, would it not be common sense to do what's best for the fund's performance and, in this case, the value for money received from Canadian taxpayer dollars? But if it is, as I suspect, then why has there been a failure to implement such an obvious standard to a federally funded foundation that had used at least $1 billion in taxpayers' funds? So let's know that those who are listening now that it was common sense Conservatives who fought against this corrupt government after 9 years, and it'll be common sense Conservatives who will work diligently to undo the mess that this has caused our nation. So I've already pointed out that the Auditor General had serious concerns with this glorified green slush fund. I would also like to bring it all together to a final point, and this goes back to what fundamentally shapes government: its people. The former chair of the SDTC had to resign as she was found to have improperly furthered the interests of companies associated with her own ventures, according to the Ethics Commissioner. Now, this is not right. The Ethics Commissioner also found that this individual participated in funding decisions that benefited her own financial interests. SDTC staff even tried to raise concerns with the staff of ISED and its minister at the time, but their concerns were ultimately dismissed. I can only know why these concerns were dismissed, but Mr. Speaker, I can tell you one thing. There has been innocent, hardworking Canadians caught in the crosshairs of this mess. On this side of the House, I believe I speak for my colleagues in that we believe in fair and just prosecution, and that I believe the inability of this Liberal government and a select elite few calling shots in these agencies and foundations that are supposed to be at arm's length does not reflect everyone involved. But that is truly the saddest part of it all. Everywhere this Liberal government has gone and touched with its paws, it has sown disorder, distrust, and broke the fabric that holds this country together. This Liberal government has lost control of their spending. After promising in 2015 that they would temporarily be in a deficit, a claim outgoing Prime Minister Stephen Harper called out from the beginning, and a claim that has cost many young Canadians affordable gas, food, and a warm place to call home. And of course, losing the humility to produce documents that would hold themselves to account even when the Speaker of the House rules that they contradict what would be in the best interest of Canadians is on them. I said at the beginning of my remarks that, and I'll say it once again, that enough is enough. This Liberal government has a history of legislative maneuvering that it uses to avoid accountability. Many believed the rhetoric of the need for a COVID election back in 2021. But the reality was that they were caught up in a scandal then as well. And that scandal involved them not wanting to provide documents for the Winnipeg lab fiasco. Of course, by calling an election, they could and did put that controversy behind them, at least for a while. A $600 million cabinet shuffle during a pandemic election was all it took to take the heat off the fact that the Speaker had moved to the next steps of controversy and took the government to court. Whether this Speaker takes similar steps remains to be seen. But the pattern is clear. Maybe proroguing Parliament will shift the focus, but when Parliament resumes after such a move, this matter still needs to be resolved. To remind Canadians of where we were at June 2021, let me read from a press release pointing out to the defiance of this government in releasing documents. This comes from the honourable member from Wellington, Halton Hills, and the honourable member from Louis Saint Laurent, the House Leader of the Opposition. They issued the following statement after the House adopted a fourth order requiring the Liberal government to hand over documents regarding a transfer of dangerous virus from the Winnipeg National Microbiology Lab to the Wuhan Institute of Virology and the subsequent firing of 2 government scientists. So yesterday, in quotes, the Speaker of the House ruled the Liberal government in breach of 3 orders of the House and its Special Committee on Canada-China Relations by continuing to cover up the Winnipeg lab breach. These orders require the government to hand over documents related to the Winnipeg lab and its work with the Wuhan Institute of Virology. The Liberal government's defiance of these orders demonstrates a complete lack of respect for Parliament and smacks of a cover-up. On June 2nd, the House adopted a motion ordering the government to hand over documents regarding the transfer of viruses from the Winnipeg lab to the Wuhan lab in March 2019 and the subsequent firing of 2 government scientists in January of 2021. This June 2nd order followed 2 previous orders from the Special Committee of March 31st and May 10th. Despite these orders, the Liberals continue to defy Parliament and cover up information about these breaches of national security. It's appalling to see just how far they will go to defy Parliament and cover up details about the Winnipeg lab and its relationship with the Wuhan lab. Some Conservatives have once again demanded the Liberal government release the documents they are hiding from Canadians so that Parliament can get to the bottom of this and ensure these breaches of national security do not happen again. However, the Liberals continue the cover-up by voting against a motion upholding the Speaker's ruling demanding the documents. And now, for the fourth time, the House has ordered the Liberal government to hand over the documents. We expect the Prime Minister to comply with this lawful order. And I would further on to state that it's time Liberals end their cover-up. It's time for Liberals to release documents and be transparent with Canadians, as Canadians deserve to know the truth about what happened at the Winnipeg lab and the breaches of national security, and Canada's Conservatives are fighting to protect our national security. So, as I said, these things have happened before. Now, there's another aspect of this that warrants more scrutiny. And I have a great deal of respect for Canadian innovators. The technology that has been supported since Sustainable Development Technology Canada was established in 2001 has been a constructive part of Canada's research and development mix. This government's obsession with green technology and the narrow scope that they've showed lately to such technology is defined, along with the now obvious lack of discipline by the board, which gives true meaning to the Green Slush Fund. What the AG found and what committee members have dug up is that 82% of funding transactions approved by the board over a 5-year sampling period was said to be conflicted. Through the AG's analysis of 226 contracts, 186 were conflicted. Then it's entirely possible that the total 405 transactions approved by the board, that a corresponding 333 contacts, could also be suspect. If the ratios were correct, there would be a further 147 suspicious contracts. A federal investigation would need to get started really soon to get to the bottom of this, since this entire affair reeks of corruption. If laws were broken and rules were ignored, then this government must get to the bottom of this. If CERB recipients were forced to return money that they were not entitled to, then I see no reason for an exception here. Canadians expect the truth, and they expect those that circumvented the rules to return the money. This government needs to get to the bottom of this scandal, and it's time to give Canadians what they want. They want accountability from this government. They want to see what is in these documents that the Liberals wish to hide so desperately from the public. And Canadians cannot wait for the chance to bring back responsible governance to the true north, strong and free. We owe it to Canadians. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.